Unlike the last two reviews I have written, I have no nostalgia for this game at all. It's the first time I've ever even beaten it. I do have nostalgia for the brand, Donkey Kong Country, of course. I've played the game several times over the last few years, but I've always put it back on the shelf after the first few levels, and usually went back and played one of the other games in the series that I just grew up with. Something always felt a little off about the game, and I just never felt compelled to complete it. Until now. I put it to a vote, and you guys decided it would be the next series for our Let's Play channel, and the whole reason I have a Let's Play channel is so I can capture footage for reviews, so it seems the right time to talk about my thoughts on the game itself. The first level of the game starts out with the familiar. Not the setting, that's totally different. But playing as Dixie, you feel right at home. Dixie's not my favorite of the Kongs to play, though, if I'm honest. And the first time you lose her, and Kiddy Kong steps up, that familiarity starts to work against you. I love the first game of the series, but Dixie was an improvement over Donkey in the gameplay department. But Kiddy does not feel better to play than Donkey, and he feels far away from playing as Diddy. For the longest time, I couldn't put my finger on why this was the case, because honestly, he doesn't even feel as good as playing as Donkey in the first game. I know exactly what it is now, though. It's not the way he controls. His movement is fine, and I like the way he carries his barrel in front of him. I like his little animations. Some of his character that comes through in the animations is really good. I don't really like the scream he has when he dies or you lose a life, but, you know, can't... It's basically a big baby, right? That's what they were going for. But I finally figured out what the problem is. The problem is his hitbox. It's way too big. I mean, Donkey's was big in the original game, but like compared to this game, maybe it was the design. Like, you know, when you think about the original Donkey Kong Country, you have Donkey Kong as the main character, Diddy is the secondary character. So all the levels are designed around Donkey, and Diddy works well in them because he's small. But this game is not designed around Kiddy Kong. It's designed around Dixie. And Dixie is smaller. And so her smaller hitbox usually serves as the measuring stick for enemy placement. If you want a tight squeeze to get the characters through, then, you know, they measured it based off of Dixie. It's just what the game, you know, she's the main character of the game. And, you know, in DKC2, this was not a problem because, you know, both the characters are the same size. And in the original DKC, it wasn't a problem because Diddy, the secondary character in that game, was smaller than Donkey, who was the main character. But making your secondary character bigger, and I'm not exactly sure this is the design philosophy that went into it, but Kiddy just feels too big, or his hitbox feels too big for the small spaces that the game often tries to get you to get through. It can be agonizingly frustrating to navigate him through levels when Dixie is not there to carry him. I think if his hitbox was just a little bit smaller, or if the enemy placement considered his size better, I would have no complaints in the control department at all. The game would feel much, much better than it does. Graphically, though, the game's color palette is unique compared to the first two. It feels more cartoon-like. The brighter and rounder enemies and character sprites really shine through. The colors are brighter. I do not necessarily prefer it to DKC2, as I like the previous entry setting and theme. I mean, pirates, how do you top that? But the game is more graphically impressive when it comes to the quality of the pre-rendered elements and the effects. The N64 had been out for about 2 months by the time the game was released, but this game makes an argument for the continued relevance of the Super Nintendo. That relevance is displayed even today as homegrown games and modern releases emulate that 16-bit style. That said, few of these games dip into the pre-rendered style, and I think that the appearance of DKC3 in particular makes a compelling argument that a game could be made today with those methods and it would be mechanically and graphically impressive. I hear a lot of people dog on pre-rendered characters and you know, that were popular during that sort of 16-bit to 32-bit transition, that they don't look very good. But this game looks really good, and it looks good even on more modern displays than just on CRTs. I mean, obviously it looks better on a CRT because that's what it was designed for, but it doesn't look bad on an LCD. And I don't know, I've sort of come around in my thinking about pre-rendered graphics the more I've been playing these games. So my really only criticism that I have for Donkey Kong Country 2 was the increased number of levels that relied on gimmicks to provide variety to the player. I'm aware that this is a subjective opinion, but to me, any element added for variety should never be at the expense of player control. And while DKC 2 dipped into this territory a few times, DKC 3 goes all in. Ellie's levels, the elephant, where she's afraid of mice, or the last level of the game where the pink gas reverses your controls, and these are especially egregious examples. The worst level for me in the game was the coin dozer level with the enemies that mad dog you until you fall into a pit. That said, I like DKC 2, not all of them are bad. I particularly like the green gas moon physics level and a few others, but they add variety without sacrificing player control. In a platform game in particular, player control has to come first when designing any level, and some of the levels in the game feel like the gimmick is in the driver's seat. When it does come together properly, the game can be every bit as good as any of the others in the series. The bosses in this game are no joke. I think that the team must have had, something to prove when designing them. Almost all of them have multiple stages and take several hits to take down. They usually have very specific methods planned by the developer for dispatching them, and you have very little room to be creative in your approach or to even make mistakes. They feel a generation away from the bosses in the original game. Really, the secret to them is pattern memorization more than player skill. Spending lives to learn where to stand and when to strike is not my favorite boss strategy when you have limited lives. In games like Hollow Knight, it works well because you have infinite lives and the consequences for death are, there, but they're not tied to a system that starts you back over whenever you die so many times. It can be really frustrating to only have a few lives to go through before you have to navigate to a title screen again to get back to where you were. The music's good as well. It never quite rises to the level of its predecessors. I'm not really qualified to review games music mechanically. What I can tell you is that none of the tracks stay with me quite like the songs from DKC 1 and 2. They're good, but not as memorable. Indeed, they might be the most appropriate way to sum up my experience with the game in general. It was good, but just not as memorable as the other two. At least not for me. Your mileage may vary, and if someone told me that the third was their all-time favorite, I could totally see why. Honestly, I might feel the same way if Kiddy's hitbox was just a little bit smaller, or if he was just Diddy Kong or Donkey. In closing, this is a good game, worth anyone's time, but there's a reason it's not as revered as the other two in the series. The only area in which it outshines what came before is in its presentation. The unique world map and stunning visuals for the Super Nintendo are still a standout to this day, but as far as the overall experience, it falls a little short in my opinion. Should you play it? Yes. Yes, you should absolutely. It is worth your time. Honestly, it was never going to be the best on the Super Nintendo. It was made in a time and a place where it was an afterthought rather than the flagship attraction. Rare was already moving on to bigger, better things on the N64. But that's okay. It's still well put together, graphically impressive, and entertaining romp that if you can play, you totally should.